So Shabbat Shalom, Erev Tov, and again, thank you so much for inviting me into your temple, into your spiritual home. It's really been a wonderful few days already here in Savannah, and I appreciate your interest in my topic. As you know, I would like to speak a little bit about religious liberty in America of the colonial period, the revolution, and into the new nation. You already heard at services what triggered this. My training in American Jewish history was really closer to the Civil War, but having moved to Philadelphia 22 years ago, I realized I had to back up a little and get into the revolution, because if you're in Philadelphia and you're not, something about you is not 18th century, you ain't nothing. So, and this opportunity came along, and then once it happened, I realized there were current things that made this academic study even more important. The first of which is happy, and the second is not happy. The happy one is, in 2026, we'll be looking at the 250th anniversary of American independence, and I hope that there will be not just celebrations, but also some serious discussions about what America has been for 250 years and where we are and where we're going, and I really wanted very much to be part of that discussion. I know in Philadelphia we're planning right now for all types of events throughout the entire year of 2026. And just an observation, I learned since being here that this congregation, this community started in 1733, which means you all know your history here in Savannah, but without a calculator, that means in 2033, and you're looking great, you'll be 300 years old, and I'm sure you're going to have grand celebrations and hopefully some history, because you have a calendar too that precedes the United States of America. So being part of the 250th is important, and in Philadelphia we have the Museum of the American Revolution, and we have what's now called the Weitzman, the National Museum of American Jewish History, so I believe there will be the right venues to have those discussions. If you're interested in the footnotes to this talk, just today, the digital version of the new Journal of the American Jewish Archives, just go to americanjewisharchives.org, came out. The hard copy will come out later, and there'll be an article there by myself and my colleague Paul Finkelman on religious liberty and the new nation. I think it's about 40 pages long with tons and tons of footnotes. I've met a number of professors here already, and I know you like to read footnotes first, so there's an ample version. So that's the happy side of it. The less happy aspect is in reading about religious liberty and all. I took it to the present and found polls, studies from the Pew Foundation, from Brookings, and other such places. And the reality is, in the United States today, the majority of people in this country today believe that the United States is a Christian nation. And an even larger majority, 61%, believe that it was the intention of the founders to establish a Christian nation. And if that was the case, our discussion of religious liberty would be much shorter. And this is a hot button issue today. And I hope my article and the book that myself and Paul Finkelman are working on with a contract with the University Press will play in to this larger discussion about the relationship between religion state and society in the United States and how it's supposed to be structured. We are different than, let's say, a place like France, in which you also had an enlightenment, but France became a radically secular state. Government controls religion there. They have a doctrine of laïcité in France. And it's not encouraging of religion. We have religious liberty. We have an extremely complicated document that nobody in Europe understands and nobody in this country understands, because every time the Supreme Court rules on it, it means something else, called separation of church and state. And from the point of view of the Jewish community in the United States, in my opinion, no topic is more important. And for most of American Jewish history, the Jewish community has been solid as what we might call separationists, people who believe that church and state should be separate from one another. That, I'm sad to say, from my philosophical perspective, is no longer true. And that some of the most important court cases and battles involving the relationship of the institutions of religion and government in this country are being fought within the Jewish community, beginning with things like menorahs in one public space and funding for parochial schools, we would say day schools or yeshivas, and the list goes on and on. The Jewish community today is very, very deeply divided, and the side that's in favor of lowering the wall of separation claims that A, it's anachronistic, and B, it can be interpreted in many, many ways, which to me, honestly, is very troubling. Early in my career, I wrote a paper on church and state and the reform movement, looking at when the rabbinic organization, the CCAR, first formed a committee early in the 20th century, and right away they ran into a problem, because if you come out very aggressively in favor of the separation of church and state, you're accused of being anti-religion. So the question was, how could you advocate for separation and at the same time be a proponent of religious life? And it's a very tricky discussion, to say the least. As a person interested in history, I became curious as to what role Jews played at the beginning of this discussion on religious liberty and its allied concept, separation of church and state. And I know technically that's from Jefferson, it's later, it's 1802, but they all play together. And it's a very important, it's an existentially important question for us in the Jewish community. One fact stands out above all the rest in this discussion from a Jewish perspective. The United States, when it was born on July the 2nd, 1776, because July the 4th is only an effective date. The document was signed on July the 2nd. Right? That's why the founders said that July 2nd will be remembered forever in America. How much more okay? It was written, it was passed on the 2nd and became effective on the 4th. When the United States became a country without really batting an eyelash and without all of the enmeshed discussions that were taking place, really just beginning to take place in the UK and on the continent, the assumption was that Jewish males were enfranchised citizens, not quite without any restrictions, but the belief was they were going to be this new thing called citizen, because before that, you weren't a citizen, you were a subject. You were a subject of the realm, which was very different. Jews were almost subjects of the realm. And now we were going to experiment with citizenship and whether or not Jews could be enfranchised as full citizens. And in this country, the starting assumption was that yes, Jewish males were going to be full citizens. Women were not full citizens. As you know, it took a long time into the 20th century, except for a very short period in New Jersey where they gave women rights. But that, they said, oh my God, what do we do when they took it away? I have a house in New Jersey, so I can understand why they made mistakes. But so how is it that people like Madison and Washington included Jews? Because their home country really was England, was the UK. England becomes the UK, I think it's 1717 or so. Why were they so different? And how did they get to be so inclusive? And what was the process of breaking down restrictions on the Jews? And that's what we wanted to study about. And as I told you at services, which by the way, Rabbi and Cantor totally enjoyed, it was lovely. Thank you. I needed a little Shabbat, so thank you. Luckily it comes every week. And, so we started to look into it. If we back up, I was told I have about 45 minutes. This is a 14-week semester. Either I'm going to have to summarize or talk fast. I don't know which it's going to be. But if you back up, before Europeans come here, Jews are universally excluded. Jews are universally excluded from being subjects, let alone being citizens. The two largest colonizing powers in the Western Hemisphere were Spain and Portugal, where basically being Jewish was a capital crime. And the penalty for being Jewish or thinking of converting somebody to Judaism was death. There's a lot of reevaluation today in the historical literature about the Inquisition and how much of it is just anti-Spanish British propaganda and all that kind of stuff. It was still pretty big. And when Spain and Portugal come to North America, they bring the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisition with them, and there was no chance for the public practice of Judaism, which does not mean there weren't conversos embedded within the conquistadores and on the boat with Columbus, but not out. They weren't out of the closet. So you have that. The French, in setting up their empire here, even though they were beginning to grant Jews rights as early as the 14th century, they were also burning the Talmud in front of Notre Dame, but beginning a little bit of liberalization. The French passed what they called the Code Noir, the Black Code, which essentially prohibited Jewish settlement in French colonies. So we're 0 for 3. Okay? That leaves two major powers who will deal with Jews in the New World. The first were the Dutch. Holland was a break-off of Spain. Holland was accepting of the Jewish community. It was a bifurcated community. There was a Spanish part of the Dutch world, and there was an Ashkenazi part. And you know, within the Jewish community, we don't always get along, so there were issues between the Spanish Jews and the German Jews who were also going to Amsterdam. And they were expanding Jewish rights, certainly economic rights, rights to worship. Many of you, I'm sure, have been to the unbelievably great Sephardic synagogue in Amsterdam. Was, to use a mixed metaphor, the mother church of Judaism in the New World. And it's primarily to Dutch colonies where Jews leaving Europe are going to go. And then following the the Dutch example comes the British. And the British are late to the game in the sense that in the year 1290, England expels its Jews. And it's not until the 1650s, approximately the same minute, when the first Dutch Jews arrived in New Amsterdam, that Jews were allowed back into England. England, as you know, at that time frame in the 17th century, had been taken over by Oliver Cromwell. And when presented with the writ of expulsion, excuse me, of 1290, did not sign it again, so he didn't renew it. So by 1655, Jews are allowed in England itself, which also meant that Jews were allowed in the British Empire. So the Jews really had two places to go in the New World, first Dutch and then English. And in the tiniest of numbers, they start coming to this side of the pond, first in South America, the Caribbean, and then only very late in the game up here to North America. The event that brought Jews as a group to North America takes place in 1654. The Portuguese had lost control of a port city, easternmost part of the coast of South America, and I never say this name right because it's a Portuguese pronunciation, but I say Recife, but I know it's Recife or something like that. But you'll just look at a map, it's the easternmost point. And there was a thriving Jewish community, the largest in the New World, the largest in South America, the largest in the Caribbean, and Recife had 1,000 Jews. In 1654, they had 2 synagogues, which is, the old Jewish joke, you're stranded on an island, one Jewish person, he builds 2 synagogues so he can go to one and boycott the other one. So, 1,000 Jews, they had rabbis. A Hebrew rabbinic book was already written in the 17th century. But the Portuguese and the indigenous population win, and the Jews have to flee. Interestingly, the Sephardic Dutch Jews, they were Iberian Jews, gone through Holland and then to the New World, and then to South America, were embraced in the community of Recife, and when the city was under attack, joined the military and were part of the defense, which is very important actually in the American story as well, a critically important part of the story. And you know that that's certainly true here in the early history of Georgia. Well, they lose and they had to flee, and there was 23 of them, and the boat takes them to the southern shore of Cuba, and it is no longer seaworthy. But Cuba was under the Spanish, which meant there was an Inquisition, and they had 2 choices, leave or go to barbecue, and they were not interested, so they left. Many went back to Holland, some went to other Curacao, other places like that. But 23 of them go to New Amsterdam in September of 1654, where they are greeted by a very grumpy governor of New Amsterdam by the name of Peter Stuyvesant. This concludes my lecture. And it was the straw that broke the camel's back for him. He said, look, I have Catholics here. I have runaway blacks. I have pirates. I have everything in this colony. Do I really have to have Jews too? Okay. So he wrote a letter to the Dutch West India Company protesting and asking for permission to remove or at least deny them the right to unpack. Okay? And the Dutch West India Company had a tiny percentage of Jewish stakeholders. You know, sometimes you get a mythic version of this story where they owned it, and they were not. It was a tiny little percentage. But Dutch West India Company was in business to make money, and they felt Jews arriving there would be a good thing. So they told Stuyvesant that they could stay on good behavior, and he really had no choice. His letter is the classic statement of the paradoxical nature of anti-Semitism. Dear members of the board, refugee Jews are arriving here in my colony. They are poor. They will be a burden to the state. I cannot afford them. Furthermore, we know that Jews are very clever in business, and before you know it, they will have all of our money. So it was like President Lowell of Harvard in the 20s wrote a letter that he wanted a Jewish quota at Harvard because A, the Jews were too clannish, and B, they assimilate too rapidly. So part of the nature of anti-Semitism is that it's paradoxical, exactly. So they stay, and one of the first things they ask for actually is the right to be in the military, to defend the Dutch colony, the right to do business, the right to worship God in their own way, and he fights them tooth and nail everywhere. And the actual initial colony of settlement of Jews almost disappears. My teacher was Jacob Marcus, and he had laws of American Jewish history, and it certainly applies to New Amsterdam. The first law of American Jewish history, according to Marcus, was the first Jews to arrive in a given place are greeted by the Jews who are already there. And that was certainly the case. There were at least one, if not three Jews already. They just come a little bit earlier that summer. Interestingly, and especially what I've learned in the last 36 hours, almost the exact opposite experience was here in Georgia. What happened in New Amsterdam, you could say, was typical of Europe. Europe had a 1,000-year, 1,500-year tradition of excluding Jews, of persecuting Jews, and marginalizing Jews. And here you have this Oglethorpe. Although I think the original charter probably did not allow Jewish settlement, once it was a reality, not only is he embracing, I saw a map, was it here, BH, that not only lays out early Savannah, but it shows you where the Jewish homes are going to be. And that is really a radically different story. And eventually, the Oglethorpe model versus the Stuyvesant model becomes a paradigm for what will become the United States of America. Okay? So Jews arrive here in 1654. The British take over the Dutch colony in 1664. So basically from New England down to the Florida border, you have English colonies and this tiny Jewish community. Let's say by 1720, you had the immense number of 250 Jews scattered across 13 English, 13 British colonies who were weaving their way into society. Most of them are small business people. A few among the aristocrats become involved in transatlantic shipping. They start 5 communities up and down the coast, beginning with New York was first, and then here, and
Rhode Island.
and then Newport, New York, Newport, Savannah, Philadelphia, and Charleston. And you get, they're all maritime. They're all maritime. Richmond and Baltimore are second generation.
All of America.
The original 5 are maritime communities from Newport here. And they don't Lancaster and Baltimore are inland. Lancaster develops fairly quickly after settlement in Philadelphia, and the rest take a very long time to develop. They're not really colonial communities, and the Jews are not crossing the Allegheny Mountains for settlement until the beginning of the 19th century. So you have these five maritime communities, and what they form are kihilot. The model of autonomous synagogues, as opposed to a Jewish community of which a synagogue is a subset, is really the product of the 19th century. In Europe, in the Middle East, whether it's under Christianity or under Islam, Jews have Kihila Kedosha, the sacred community, and then that board controls all of the agencies of Jewish life, whether it's one synagogue, two synagogues, the cemetery, the school, the Hebrew school for boys, etc. So you have the Kihila system, and all of the initial five maritime communities set up their Kihilot and begin to create Jewish life here. In different places, they are able to function in different ways. Okay? The northernmost one is Newport in Rhode Island. Rhode Island was the haven for dissidents, religious dissidents in New England. For example, some truly horrible dissident groups like Quakers and Baptists, because they're not Congregationalists, they're not Puritans. So Jews find a home in Roger Williams' colony, but they're not terribly free there. They're not terribly free. So, for example, when Aaron Lopez, who was a transatlantic shipper and a whaler, applies for naturalization in Rhode Island in the 1770s, he's denied. So it's not quite as free. Then you have New York, which is the initial place of settlement. The first Kehillah, Sherei Israel, is there, and they move out to New England, not to New England, but to Rhode Island, and then to Philadelphia. Charleston and Savannah actually have other stories of origin. And in each place, there are different sets of rules. The least, and somebody asked me this early tonight, maybe a line here, the least hospitable place in the colonies was New England. It was Puritan and then Congregationalist. And the irony, and I read this already in a 19th century text, is that in New England, they loved Hebrew and they hated Hebrews. So Harvard, Yale, etc. requires Hebrew in seminary education. There's probably 300 Puritan ministers at one point, about 1700 or so, who are able to read it in Hebrew. In fact, when a rabbi comes from Hebron to speak at Yale, the only language that he and Ezra Stiles, the president of Yale, had in common was Hebrew. And I'm going to assume it was the Hebrew of the Mishnah, because speaking biblical Hebrew is impossible because it's a literary language. And Rabbi can tell you that there's something called vav hahipuch, which is tense reversal. If there's a conjunction before a verb, instead of reading it in the past, you have to read it in the future. So I don't know anybody can actually speak that. But Mishnaic Hebrew, the Mishnah from Talmud, is very clean. And they had a public discussion in Hebrew, and it just wowed. It wowed everybody. Where there was limited voting, Jews could vote. Jews could have residence. Naturalization, becoming a subject or a citizen, was much more complicated in the colonial period. In a few instances, Jews were actually appointed to public office. And my favorite was in New York in the 1730s and 40s. One of the sheriffs in New York City, who was appointed then, a guy named Cohen, so they were sure he was Jewish, was appointed a sheriff. And he accused another Jew of stealing from him and tried him pretty much without evidence and had him hanged. And he was the first Jew who was executed in the colonies. But he was hanged by another Jew. The part that I relate to in this story was the defendant, because his name was Moses Sussman. But as far as I know, my family was still completely in Minsk, so we were not related to the first Jewish worth sleep in America. The situation across the colonies was very, very uneven with respect to rights. Jews could not practice law. Jews could not serve as a judge. They could be appointed to public office. There wasn't much by way of elected office. They were generally welcomed. There certainly was grassroots immigration. The different story, of course, was Georgia in its founding period because of how Oglethorpe handled the situation. From the point of view of the whole seaboard, there's a signal that something is different in the year 1765, when the British passed, as part of the whole Stamp Act business, the Non-Importation Acts. And a dozen or so Jewish businessmen signed a petition against the Non-Importation Acts. In Yiddish, you call that chutzpah. Okay? In England, and certainly it wasn't Germany yet, it was the Holy Roman Empire or in monarchical France, Jews were not going to sign a political petition against the government. That was not going to happen. Jews were not enfranchised in any way. The situation here was kind of loose. And they felt free to do it. And ironically, 12 years later, 11 years later, when the revolution starts to crystallize, some of those petitioners stay loyal to the crown and some go with independence. But nevertheless, that's kind of the signal that Jews are interested here in being part of the body politic, which was not the case in the home country in Great Britain, where most of Jewish political activity in terms of improving the situation of Jews in England had to do with getting economic rights, kind of siloed specific economic rights, and they didn't push hard for political rights. And in fact, England really does not enfranchise its Jews and allow Jews to practice law and sit in parliament until the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, long after the American Revolution. When the fighting breaks out in the revolution, something revolutionary happens here in the States. You already saw it with Peter Stuyvesant. It was already present here in a legal sense in Georgia. Jews joined the fight. Jews joined the fight. We don't know exactly how many Jews fought in the American Revolution. The number, because nobody has really studied this properly. There is a massive study going on right now, much bigger, much more problematic, of Jews in the Civil War, Adam Mendelsohn, if any of you followed his work. And somebody needs to sit down and really study about the number of Jews, but the usual number is between 100 and 120. There's 2,500 Jews in the colonies at this point, and approximately 20 of those Jewish soldiers are officers. And that's the real dividing line, because in Europe, for example, in Hesse, Jews could be recruited as mercenaries, so that we know during the war, among the Hessian soldiers, there were Jews, Jewish mercenaries, basically. But what Jews couldn't be were officers. And not only were Jews officers, but who's your officer here in the Revolutionary Army? It's Mordecai Sheftal. At what rank? Colonel. Colonel. okay? In Washington's army at the beginning of the war, Washington himself was 2 stars, not 5. You know, it wasn't World War II and I like Ike and all that. It only went up to 2 stars, which meant that Mordechai Sheftal was on the 3rd rung from the top. That is unimaginable in Europe at the same time. England actually doesn't even have a military academy at this point, but no Jew, no matter what their class might have been in society, would have been empowered to order Christian soldiers into battle and die. And here we have a load of Jewish soldiers up and down the conflict, basically in every theater. And Sheftal was the highest ranking. Most served with great distinction. One in particular got in a lot of trouble. His name was David Salisbury Franks, who was from Philadelphia and had gone to Quebec to make his fortune after his bar mitzvah. And he was in the army of David Montgomery, and of course they lost to the British, and that's how England got to take all of Canada, et cetera, et cetera. The problem was David Salisbury Frank's commanding officer was a guy named Benedict Arnold. And he stayed with Benedict Arnold. And as a result of that, David S. Franks, unlike Mordechai Sheftal, had to stand trial multiple times to prove his worthiness, and he was given amnesty multiple times by George Washington. It was a very tough fight. I'm sure there was some anti-Semitism in the mix, but Jews generally served with distinction. The Jews who supported England in the fight left and either went back to England or moved north, which is the founding of the Canadian Jewish community. So even before they begin to debate law and the place of Jews in society, you already have the de facto presence of Jews on the ground serving in important roles in the course of the American Revolution. This needs to turn from de facto to de jure with the Declaration of Independence. With the Declaration of Independence, I know I'm about to get in trouble because everybody in this room is either a de jure docent or a de facto docent. I already heard it and no one responds. So every colony now needs a state constitution. And you know the federal government itself is very weak and not taking stands on anything under the Articles. So it's really about the state constitutions. And the state constitutions find a mechanism to keep Jews out of public office, sometimes explicitly, but mostly just by inference, and that's why that committee I referred to studied the 13 state constitutions. The most embracing from a Jewish point of view was New York, that allowed Jews in, but they didn't let Catholics in. Virginia wasn't bad, and Georgia, for all of its, I'm scared to death to say this, for all of its inclusiveness in the 1730s, in 1777 had a bad moment. And in the first state constitution of Georgia, no rocks yet, it says that to hold public office, you have to be Protestant. Okay, and it had one other interesting stipulation. No minister of religion, sorry, Rabbi, could serve in state government. Okay, and that lasts for a few years, and I think the second state constitution comes in 1789 or so, and that removes the word Protestant, guarantees freedom of religion, but retains the law that ministers still can't be elected to public office. And any rabbi or minister who's ever given a political sermon will feel the heat of where that's coming from. Right? I live in Pennsylvania, and what happened, and I'm not going to go through all 13 colonies, but in Pennsylvania, you have a state constitution which prohibits Jews from taking public office in the first state constitution. And interestingly, only one delegate to the state constitution convention protested it. And he had been a long-term friend of the Jewish community, and his name was Benjamin Franklin, who said that this is not what the American Revolution was about. And when they wrote the second state constitution, they got rid of the discriminatory clause. Okay? The Jewish community in Philadelphia had a committee that studied the state constitutions, and even before the constitutional conventions began, they were doing their work and then sent communications, sent newspaper op-ed pieces, sent direct to the conventions later, saying that there should be no disability. And by the time you get to the federal constitution, okay, you get a clause with respect to oath of office that in no way the language includes words which would be exclusionary of Jews, Catholics, or anybody else. And that is the beginning of freedom of religion and full emancipation of Jews in the United States. But in the language of Article 6, it says there will be no religious test oath, very significantly, under these United States. And that quickly was understood at the state level to mean the federal government. Under these United States was referencing only the federal level, which was New York, Philadelphia, and only much later, after 1800, Washington, D.C., so that under the federal government, which, of course, you have the supremacy clause and all of that, but you have established here in the United States that there will be no legalized, constitutionally based basis for anti-Semitism. And because of that, you can say, I think without objection or qualification, that the United States becomes the first country in the world to allow Jews to be full-throated citizens. They're in the military, they can hold public office, they're allowed to practice law, they're allowed to be judges, the list goes on and on. So the United States literally is revolutionary, and we make the case that A, the presence of Jews, just the mere presence, because there's such a tiny percentage, and their participation in the military, their participation, albeit small, in the political process, helped shape what becomes religious liberty. And we attach this to, historiographically, to use a big history word, to the writings of a scholar by the name of Gary Nash, who claims that the American Revolution was not just a top-down phenomena out of the Enlightenment enacted by what he calls the marble men, the Jeffersons and Madison, who all become marble men, but it was also a bottom-up experience where all parts of different society buy into precepts of the American Revolution, of equal justice under law, et cetera, et cetera. What they don't do at the end of the 18th century, including the Jewish community, is to then extend the argument and say, well, if Jews, one of the most persecuted people in all of history, can be included in the American body politic, what about the African slaves in this country? They do not make that shift. They do not make that shift. And by and large, American Jews are quiet on the topic of abolition well into the Civil War, well into the Civil War. And that's a whole other discussion about the history of Jews and blacks in the United States. Even the Reform movement, which starts in 1824 in Charleston, for the first 10, 11 years of existence, does not say a word about slavery, and most of the leadership of the movement is involved in slavery itself. Again, the percentage with respect to slavery is tiny, and slavery would have been the same without Jews, as Bert Korn wrote, but Jews would not have been the same had they not been part of the peculiar institution. So you get under the federal government, Jefferson, who writes his famous letter to the Baptists of Danbury, coins the phrase separation of church and state. In the meanwhile, you get the Bill of Rights, but it is understood that this non-restriction only applies to the federal level, and that the states can go about their business as they please, although they can be challenged based on federal principle. The most interesting case, early case, actually comes up in the state of Maryland. Maryland, as you know, had been formed as a Catholic colony, which is then, as part of the Glorious Revolution in England, is overthrown and becomes a viciously anti-Catholic colony and persecutes its Catholics. And if you're going to persecute Catholics, you might as well persecute Jews. And Jews were not allowed to hold office. And an election comes up for city council in Baltimore, and Jews are not allowed to run for office in Maryland. So Jefferson, as president, takes note of this and understands the difference between federal law and state law. And what does he do? He appoints a Jew as a federal marshal in Maryland, which is the Afsalachas school, the Dafka school of Jewish history, so that Maryland begins a debate, which turns into a long political process resulting in legislation between 1824 and 1826 known as the Jew Bill, in which the prohibition on Jews holding public office is lifted in the state of Maryland. And Reverend, you'll be interested to know this, the sponsor of the Jew Bill was Representative Thomas Kennedy, who was Presbyterian. And he said that, we have to get rid of these religious restrictions. There was another case in North Carolina that right now is under complete review. Jacob Henry, is that a familiar name? Who in his second term for office, I believe North Carolina at that point was unicameral, was challenged after he won his election on the grounds that he could not take the oath of office because it had to be a Bible that was Old Testament and New Testament. And eventually he won and he went in. Exactly what happened there is no longer clear. There's a scholar, believe it or not, in Ireland who's studying this right now. He's contending we basically really don't know that story, but I can remember as a kid in the 60s, they used to have these freedom shrines and shopping malls, strip malls. They didn't have shopping malls yet with ceilings on them. And Jacob Henry's protest speech would show up along with the Declaration of Conscience, and basically he said, judge me by what I do. You can't judge me for what I have inside of my head and don't make public, but vote based on my actual behavior. And it became known as a model speech for freedom of religion. The last of the original states that included a exclusionary clause on Jews being elected at the state level was in New Hampshire. And as I said, New England was the big problem. And it stayed a big problem in terms of Jews in American politics as late as believe it was 1912, when Wilson nominated Louis Brandeis to the court. The most strenuous objections came from the Brahmins of New England. Others allowed it in. That did not end anti-Semitism in the United States. And then there were tremendous battles all along the way, too numerous to mention, but I'll conclude with this one story as late as the Civil War, because it is so definitive. And that is when the Union, am I allowed to talk about the Union? When the Union starts its draft to fight the secessionists, okay, they call for the raising of a much larger army. And in the legislation, it calls for a chaplaincy corps. It calls for a chaplaincy corps, and that the chaplains in the United States military had to be ministers of the gospel. The supervising agency over the chaplaincy corps was the brandly new minted and very evangelical YMCA. And they made it their business to organize supervisory teams to go out to Union Army bases. And in one case, Washington was so vulnerable because it was right on the line with Virginia. There were dozens, scores of forts around. They get to an army base, and they discover that the chaplain on the base is Jewish. And they're outraged, and they demand to speak to the commanding officer, meet with him, and lodge their protest. And they say, you know, we're from the YMCA, congressional legislation demands minister of the gospel, and this guy is Jewish. You've got to take him off. And the man's answer was, my name is Colonel Max Friedman, and you can leave. And the legislation was rewritten. Same, General Grant, as you know, signed a general order removing Jews from the Department of Tennessee, which was to force Jews out of that Army area of operation on the grounds that they were interfering with Army business through peddling. And it was taken to the White House by several groups of Jewish petitioners, and Lincoln, who was quite a philo-Semite in my opinion, instantly reversed it. Otherwise, as in England in 1290, you would have had an expulsion of Jews in the United States, and we would not be sitting here today. But he insisted that Jews were fully enfranchised and could not be expelled from anywhere in the United States as a group. So what the story tells us is, from the beginning of European colonization in North America, although many of the European traditions of anti-Semitism are brought over in the luggage, there are developments toward freedom of religion, that Jews fight in the revolution, they become part of the political discussion, and then once they have the federal constitution, have worked vigorously to expand what the definition of religious liberty is and inclusion in the United States. And I think as we approach the 250, we bear a responsibility, not just historians, but as a Jewish community, to tell the story of religious liberty in the United States, particularly at this moment, because tragically there are so many people who have misconstrued the American story with respect to freedom of religion, and thereby challenge the place of Jews in the United States. And I'll make a very strong statement now to conclude. No other country has extended more freedom and security of law to the Jewish people than the United States. And that is a fight that our ancestors took up, and that is a fight I believe that we have to continue. Thank you so much.